The Legend of Ashley Fox by John Carrick. Ashley Fox Volume 2, Ninja Orphan, Part 1, On Fighting. Prologue, Flying Dragons. June 19th, 2309. The arrival of a giant tuxedoed lion caused chaos among the students of the Flying Dragons Martial Arts Academy. The monster cat weighed in at just over 100 pounds, and like a panda or a killer whale, his coat sported only two colors. His head, back, and most of his tail were black, while white fur covered his belly, forelegs, paws, and mouth. During the summer, the academy was relatively empty, as compared to the regular school year, and the few remaining students were infatuated with the playful lion. The animal showed no aggressive behavior, but rolled and tumbled with the children, bearing neither fang nor claw. Ashley and Jeff were at breakfast when word of the massive animal spread through the school. They arrived in the courtyard with a handful of other students, excited to gawk at and play with the giant cat. However, when Ash and Jeff stepped into the courtyard, the animal ceased its games. Its ears went up, and it sniffed the air. Fixating on Ash's little brother, the lion bounded over to Jeffrey and sniffed him intently. Then, softly, the lion rubbed its face against Jeff's, licked him repeatedly, and began to purr. Ash stood next to her brother, her hand brushing the cat's thick mane. She knew that if the animal were to turn hostile, there would be little she could do to protect her brother from its claws. Across the courtyard, the head abbot entered with a pair of adults. Ashley stared, stunned. "Jeff," she said. "Jeff." In the next moment, she was running across the courtyard. "Mom!" she cried, reaching and then hugging her mother. Her father stood beside them, his hand on her shoulder. Ashley looked back to Jeff, frozen beside the lion. "Jeff!" He sprinted across to them. "Mom! Dad!" The rest of the day passed in a whirlwind. Ashley and Jeff left that very minute. They said no goodbyes, took nothing from their rooms. Dr. Fox arranged for it all to be delivered later. In the car, Jeff played with the cat, petting him and wrestling with him. "What's his name?" Jeff asked. "He doesn't have one yet. He's still a kitten," Dr. Fox answered. "Any ideas?" Jeff smiled and squinted into the sharp morning sunlight. "Mono." "Mono?" his father asked. "Yeah, short for monochrome," Jeff answered, beaming. The first night away from the academy, the Fox family moved into an absurdly expensive and secure hotel. Movie stars wandered the halls. Room service was always available, and fast. It was only temporary, but exciting for Mrs. Fox and the kids. Of course, Ashley and Jeff had dozens of questions for their father, starting with how he and their mother had survived their apparent murder. Dr. Fox explained that he had applied some first aid to their mom after Mr. Dunkirk had attacked her. There had been a kit of the healing goo in the kitchen, and it had saved her life. Director Stanwood's bullet had also been a stroke of luck. The .22 hadn't penetrated his skull and given him nothing more than a prolonged nap and a lovely new scar for his hairline. Stanwood and his cronies kept Dr. Fox's survival a secret, in hopes of blackmailing him once he recovered. But Ashley and Jeff's escape had thrown a monkey wrench into their plans. Stanwood's death at the hands of Ashley and the embarrassment of Dunkirk further frustrated any political designs against her father. He apologized profusely for not having located them sooner, but after all, the Martial Arts Academy was the last place anyone, including their parents, had thought to look. After 6 weeks in the huge suite, with maids, room service, and a carpet that felt like a fur-covered bed, Ashley didn't want to leave the hotel, certainly not to move into the spare modern house, newly purchased in uptown Angel City. There wasn't a hard edge on a single piece of furniture in the hotel. The same could not be said for the new home they were about to move into. Ashley and Jeff asked about their old possessions, but Dr. Fox explained the police had sealed the house due to the Dunkirk investigation. As far as anyone knew, it was exactly as they left it. Despite Jeff's insistent pleading, Dr. Fox refused to return to the address. He refused under any circumstances, even if it involved replacing all of Jeff's previous clothing and toys with newer, more expensive versions. Their new home, on the prestigious top shelf of the technology sector, was a cold, hard structure that made magically efficient use of space. Ashley and Jeff got to choose their own rooms, in the final tally a total of 3 each. The estate was immense and secured by heavily armed soldiers, as well as a fleet of house and groundskeepers, all living on the property. Exploring the neighborhood, Ashley and Jeff quickly discovered the Angel City parks. Miles of hoverboard ramps, multi-tiered playgrounds, and carefully cultivated forests, supervised by young citizens doing their mandatory 2 years of public service. Soon the school year started, but the horror they experienced on Calistan Way continued to haunt Ashley. Occasionally Mr. Dunkirk would make headlines again. He'd have a close call with the police, or take another victim, or be blamed for one. Ash alone seemed concerned. She regarded the threat of his return as not just probable, but inevitable, especially since she was the only living person who could link Dunkirk to any crimes. Ashley's testimony that she had found Mr. Dunkirk in the home with his murdered family, and that he had attacked her with the butcher knife, would be enough to hang the suspected murderer. Ashley knew that her mom was technically one of Dunkirk's victims. She was no longer dead. The incident had never been properly reported or filed due to Stanwood's federal interference. Whenever Ashley thought about those days, her heart would literally begin to ache, a hollow burning sensation in her chest. She missed things the way they used to be. She loved the canyon forest, their neighborhood friends, and their beagle. She missed their adventures, but those days were long gone. The day Chairman Pierce fell from the sky, everything changed. That was the day her father's prototype had first come into Ashley's possession, carried from the heavens by a divine messenger, delivering the item to the daughter of its creator. The Micronics, a computer-to-brain interface, was a device that could store thoughts, connect to other computer systems, transmit messages, anything a regular computer could do, all without the use of keyboards or monitors. Ashley didn't like to use it, but her younger brother Jeffrey had effortlessly mastered the device. Their father had never even asked about it after his return. Ashley hadn't mentioned it, and Jeff didn't talk about it either. He never borrowed it or asked Ashley about it. He'd said it worked best for him when she had it, and she always had it. In addition to being her father's unexplained legacy, the interface doubled as a knife, its single button releasing a hidden blade. After her run-in with Mr. Dunkirk and the showdown in the police station, Ashley reasoned it was best to keep the device with her at all times. Mr. Dunkirk had lived on their street as long as Ashley could remember. No one had ever suspected him of being a mass murderer. Director Stanwood had known Ashley's father all his life, and even as Stanwood shot him, Dr. Fox trusted him enough to ask for his help. Ashley's memories of her home and the canyon where she and Jeff spent so many happy hours were all tainted with concealed evil. Ashley felt death lurking all around her now, never more than one step out of sight, just waiting to jump out and say hello. She never left the device out of arm's reach, even when she slept. Just before Halloween, Mr. Dunkirk was spotted in Phoenix, but quickly vanished again. Ashley's father assured them that he had taken every precaution to protect their new address. Besides, "We aren't worried, Ash. You're here to protect us," he often joked. The idea terrified the young girl, but her family, everyone, looked at her differently now. The footage of her fight with Dunkirk, captured by the hovering police vehicles, had been all over the news. Jeffrey's big sister had brutally humiliated one of the most dangerous serial killers in history. Inside their first week at the new school, he'd turned her into a playground legend. Whenever the issue of childhood bravado reared its ugly head, Jeffrey found the spotlight. The other kids loved his stories about Ashley. They would crowd around him and listen, reverently. Ashley would notice them looking at her strangely for several days afterward. Occasionally one of Jeffrey's particularly brave classmates would get up the courage to ask her some meaningless question, and later brag to his friends about his brush with fame. Ashley didn't think of herself as a hero. She knew the truth. She was terrified. At one point she even paid Jeff to keep quiet, but the damage was already done. Ashley did not want to get caught up in the obligatory tough guy challenges leveled at any and every karate kid, especially one who happened to be female. As far as the school kids knew, she didn't practice martial arts anymore, just ballet. In truth, Ashley spent every afternoon at Flying Dragons. Now she showed the same single-minded devotion for violence she'd once shown for dance. Whenever news of Dunkirk's continuing escapades reached the girl, she redoubled her efforts. Wednesday, September 14th, 2310. The night before her 15th birthday, after Ashley came home from practice, Dr. Fox approached her in the kitchen. "There's something I want to ask you." Ashley and Jeff had been reunited with their parents for a little over a year now. The family had finally settled into something that, on the surface, appeared regular, safe, and happy. "Yes," Ashley answered. Her father half sat, half leaned, against a tall stool, pinning it against the kitchen center island. Ash was already unnerved by his very presence. Lately he'd been nice enough. He had not been like that when she was younger. Ever since he'd returned from the grave, finding them at Flying Dragons, the stern man he'd once been was no more. "So you really didn't want to go to that kung fu camp?" he said, awkwardly. "No, I didn't." Ashley found it easy to be cold toward him. She didn't trust this kinder, gentler man. He was and yet was not her father. After witnessing his death, that had changed her. He was here, and yes, he cared for her, but Ashley was no longer a child, and she no longer sought the protection of her parents. In this moment, that feeling isolated her. He continued, "But you went, and then you went back. You spent a whole year there, and now you go all the time." This she had not expected. The girl paused, waiting for the question, making him ask whatever it was he wanted to know. "Well, why?" "You know why. You were dead. Things changed." Fox waited, apparently unsatisfied with the short answer. Suddenly he was her dad again. The old man was there, watching, judging. "And because, well, they were searching for a ballerina. If I went to ballet school, Jeff and I would be dead now." He smiled. "You loved ballet. You were so talented." She saw through his words. This is something he'd been planning to ask her, for some time now. Ashley narrowed her eyes. She had not once lost her sense of self when confronted by the murderous Dunkirk. Not when experiencing a distortion in time that could only have been a mild hallucination. When first holding her father's device, the micronics, she hadn't seen anything happen. What she'd felt had been a lack of things happening. She hadn't felt the breeze on her face, or heard the rustle of the branches, rubbing their limbs together in the cool winds. That didn't mean that they had stopped. In a sudden epiphany, Ashley realized it hadn't been a lack of time at all, but a lack of sensation. When she released the device into her back pocket, the connection had broken, and her other senses had rushed back in. Just like this moment, she thought to herself. She paused and wondered how she could explain, to herself, the frozen laser light and transfixed friends. She could not, so she put it out of her mind, resolving to deal with it later, or possibly never. Her father was still watching her. Only a fraction of a second had passed. She didn't drop eye contact. "I worked hard," she said, "but I didn't love it. It didn't add up to anything." "What does that mean, it didn't add up to anything?" "I did it to prove I was better than the other girls, not because I liked it. I did it because other women look up to dancers, and men prize them, not because I loved it." Dr. Fox said nothing. "I don't do this out of that same place. I do this because I don't want to end up like those people in the canyon." That never should have happened. Ash heard him clearly. She knew he was somehow involved with the man who fell from the sky that afternoon, 2 summers ago. She knew the black knife was at the center of it all. She knew something else, too, but she did not know what that something was, only that she possessed the micronics, and it made her powerful. She did not need to know anything more. She did not want to hear the whole story. She was not ready for that yet. He seemed as if he needed her to be ready, as if there were something he wanted to tell her. She hoped that he would wait, maybe a few weeks, or a few years. Their life had just gotten good. Ashley explained. "Jeffrey does things because he wants to. He does things for fun. The way he used to play with Jack and how he does his experiments. I'm not like that." He took a breath and leaned back, relaxing against the counter. "I see. What are you like?" Ashley hesitated. "I do this because I have to. This is something I have to do. It was the same with ballet. I don't know why, but I had to." She stood quietly for a moment. "It's weird. I was mean about ballet, but I'm not about this. Because this is all about being mean, I can be nice. I don't know if that makes any sense." Dr. Fox tilted his head, inviting further explanation. "It's different than ballet. That was all about what I could do. Now I just want to learn, and help the other kids learn too. I'm not doing it just for me, but for Jeff, and everyone. Because the bad guys are out there somewhere, and they're not the other kids." Her father smiled. "I'm better than most of the boys already," she said, smiling back. "Of course you are." He hugged her. "I know you don't always like it when I tell you to look out for your brother, but I'm glad you're here to protect him. I can count on you." "You're here too, right? We're safe here, aren't we?" He moved toward the fridge. "Of course," he said, as he opened the door, filling the room with the light from the interior. "But then again, we were safe back on Calistan too," he pointed out, "until we weren't." He turned back to face her, abandoning whatever it was he'd wanted, letting the door swing closed, shutting out the illumination. Fox raised his hands to his daughter's shoulders and looked her in the eyes. "That's why I made you go. That's the way life works, the way knowledge and experience work. Once you need it, if you don't have it, it's too late." Chapter 1. The Good Life. Thursday, September 15th, 2310. Ashley could hear her mom yelling from downstairs. She hated her mother's proclivity to shout commands from one end of the house to the other. Ash rolled her eyes behind closed lids and buried her head back in the pillow, trying to savor the last few moments of warm, comfortable sleep before the grueling process of waking and preparing for school began. Her mother's voice in the doorway startled her. "You're going to be late." "So?" she said, the pillow swallowing her flip reply. She heard her mom bark a similar charge to Jeff from down the hall. Today was Ashley's 15th birthday. She didn't see why she should have to go to school on her birthday, but she rolled from bed and pulled on a jersey. In the hallway, as she stumbled toward the bath, Jeffrey sprinted past her. He reached the bathroom first and slammed the door on her face with a hurried, "Sorry, Ash, gotta go." "Damn it, Jeffrey." Ashley pounded on the door with her fist. Back in her room, she calculated her options and fell back into bed. "Ashley Aaron Fox, get up now!" her mom screamed from the downstairs kitchen. Ashley sat up to yell back, "Jeff's in the bathroom." "No, I'm not," her brother replied from the kitchen table. A few minutes later, she stood in the bathroom doorway, her face flushed with rage. The room was a complete mess. Pools of water stood all over the floor, a towel lay soaked in a corner. The countertop was covered with spilled soap and toothpaste, sloppily smeared about. "Jeffrey!" she screamed in frustration. Later outside, Jeff and Ash headed down the front walk. Their parents waved from the doorway. "Take care of your brother, Ash," her father instructed, as he had every day for almost the entire past year. Ash waved goodbye to their parents. As they turned away and the door closed, she brought her hand down across the back of Jeff's head. He yelled and spun to confront her. They rarely got into fights. Jeffrey was 4 years younger, and even angry he posed a little threat, which usually fueled his frustration rather than tempered it. "What the heck?" he yelled. Ash stepped toward him, scowling. Jeff took an involuntary step back. "What did I do?" "I told you a million times, stop leaving the bathroom a mess. If you can't wait till after I get out, at least leave it clean." "You could use the one downstairs," he argued. "So could you." Ashley walked through the gate, holding it open for him. "Come on." "You didn't have to hit me," he said as he passed her. "Tomorrow I go first," she answered. "Really, I just had to go," he said. "You leave it a total disaster every day." "You never hit me like that before," Jeff glared. "I'm sorry, but you have to think about other people sometimes." She put an arm over his shoulder, but he shrugged her off and stepped forward, moving out of reach. "I'm sorry, you're right, it was mean. I'll never hit you again." "Promise?" "Yes, I promise." "You have to say it," he said. "Promise I won't hit you again," Ash said. "Ever?" "Ever." Jeff stood still. It was apparent he didn't genuinely believe her. "Come on," she smiled. "I didn't hit you that hard." Jeff wrinkled his nose as he rubbed the back of his head. Ash stepped forward to put her arm around him again, walking them toward the shuttle stop that would take them to school. As Ashley and Jeff approached the walled campus, Ash's friend Mandy waved from the gate. Ash and Mandy stood roughly the same height, both tall for their age. 5'7" and female, but the similarities ended there. From Mandy's short, wavy blonde hair to Ashley's relatively straight black locks, they were as different as night and day. Mandy was a bright student who never studied and barely did her homework. She got straight B's and didn't care. She was friendly and everyone liked her. Ashley was her polar opposite, aloof, cynical, sarcastic. She rarely smiled. When it came to schoolwork or athletics, she was always in the top of her class. Not in the top 5, or the top 7, or the top 3. Ashley was always number 1. When she wasn't, it was because she consciously let someone else win, or because she wasn't in that class. She was the ultimate type A personality. But not because she tried. She put forth as little effort as possible. If the other kids had known she was sleepwalking through school, they'd have hated her that much more. Even the boys were jealous, especially of her athletic abilities. Not to mention the fact that her courage had been tested and proven against an infamous serial killer. Ash and Mandy seemed an unlikely match as friends, but they genuinely liked each other. Then again, Mandy had lots of friends. She couldn't name an enemy. Ash was fascinated with her. A A few years earlier, a ballet instructor had taken some time to explain that the ability to turn enemies into friends was what truly set people apart. Her explanation had impressed Ashley. Mrs. Raber had believed it to be the only skill worth actually having. Of course, it was the only thing Ashley had been unable to master, or even become functional at. Most of the other kids avoided the ultra-serious Ash. She couldn't pinpoint why. Perhaps they felt outclassed, outgunned. That was fair, and relatively accurate. Ashley didn't try to beat the other students, but they did seem to have an air of deference and defeat in her presence. It wasn't her fault that school, really all of life, was arranged as a competition. She'd heard that in other more dignified cultures, there was a greater sense of teamwork. Unfortunately, that was not where she lived. Ash and Mandy didn't feel compelled to define their friendship, which existed almost exclusively at school. Together, the three of them, Ash, Mandy, and Jeff, slipped across the courtyard. The first bell rang. Jeff smiled, waved to Ash, and set out toward his classroom. 2 steps later, he returned and hugged her. "Happy birthday," he said. Before she could reply, he'd run off toward his wing. Mandy grinned at Ash. "It's your birthday? I had no idea." "Yeah, well," Ashley replied. "It's the 15th. Your golden birthday," Mandy smiled. "We should do something. We gotta have a party for you this weekend." "I can't. I've got so much stuff this weekend." "You've always got stuff," Mandy said. The girls stood quietly for a moment, Ashley's usual and predictable rejection of weekend companionship still lingering in the air. "What are you going to do?" Ashley said softly. "I don't know. Watch cartoons, eat pizza and ice cream." Her clipped words clearly expressed her dissatisfaction, but she immediately adjusted her tone. "Find a party, I guess." Ashley looked down but didn't offer to join her friend. The girls stood silently beside each other. Chapter 2. Lunchtime Traffic. Dr. Fox, still quite fit for his 50s, approached his radiant wife, already seated at a table near the fountain in an overly floral restaurant. He looked around, impressed. "Wow, they really work hard on this place," he said. Mrs. Fox smiled and nodded. "I told you it was nice." Her eyes sparkled in the diffuse sunlight, reflected off the water and chromed surfaces of the restaurant. "I love you." Dr. Fox leaned in to kiss her. "I love you too," she answered. "Sorry about earlier," he apologized, running a hand through his light brown hair. "Sorry for what?" she asked. "On the phone, when I hung up, I forgot to tell you that I love you." Mrs. Fox blushed and smiled. "You don't have to say it every time." "But what if something happened?" he argued. "I don't want my last words to be something else." He looked down at his napkin-wrapped silverware and adjusted its position on the patterned tablecloth. "Thank you," she smiled and reached out to his hand lying on the table. "If you'd stop driving like a lunatic, you wouldn't have to worry about things like last words," she chided him. "I never even set off any proxies." "Well, except that one time," he smiled. "And that one other time," she countered. "Yeah, well, fine. We both know that today's countermeasures prevent any sort of serious life-threatening injuries during a vehicular collision." "But you aren't driving a vehicle with those life-saving countermeasures." "Yeah, but everybody else is," he answered. In an effort not to give in and laugh, Anne silently drank from her water glass. She knew she best frustrated her husband's arguments by not arguing. The waiter arrived with menus. Dr. Fox unwrapped his silverware and used the napkin to wipe his forehead. "What's going on?" his wife asked. He looked up and smiled. "We did it." "You did what, exactly?" Fox didn't answer. He just continued smiling. "The what you told me you weren't going to do? The big what?" Dr. Fox tempered his pride with a dash of humility. "Yes, that one." "You said you wouldn't." She was beyond frustrated. "I didn't do it, it did me," he attempted. "That's such a load of shit. Is this really what you want?" she asked. "We're not going forward with it if that's what you mean," he answered. "You're not." We all agreed. "Who else knows?" she asked. "Just Charles and Frank and Tom," he replied. "Jesus!" she exclaimed. "No, we left him out of this one." "We're going to have to move again," she sighed. "I've been thinking about that. You still want to get away from all this?" "I don't want to go on the run," she answered. "No, I mean, retire. For real this time. Somewhere away from the whole mess. Somewhere out in the country." "Like we talked about?" she asked. "I wasn't sure when we'd have a breakthrough, so I bought some land out in the Dakotas a while ago." Dr. Fox smiled. "I only just worry about Ash and Jeffrey." "They would love it. Wyoming? The cat could have a proper backyard." Well, it's all set up. Everything is ready, just waiting for us. We can go whenever we want. Anna smiled, her eyes wet and shining. Let's go tomorrow. Her husband leaned forward. His elbows crowded the silverware and water glass. Everything ready for Ashley's party tonight? He asked. Anna nodded. Pretty much. The house and presents are done. I just have to pick up the cake this afternoon. She didn't say anything this morning? Not to me. I'm sure she doesn't know. You're probably right. He smiled and looked out the window. Outside the building, a weaving vehicle distracted Andrew. It caused and narrowly avoided accidents in the surrounding anti-gravity lanes. Speaking of countermeasures, look at this guy, he said. Shouldn't they have kicked in by now? Anna asked, horribly fascinated by the vehicle as it barreled toward them. The car ricocheted off several others, triggering their jerky autopilot maneuvers. Vehicles slid to a hovering stop in nearby loading and emergency lanes as the offending coupe careened along the side of a building. Instead of slowing down, it accelerated. Dr. Fox cynically calculated which and how many of the malfunctioning safety devices might have allowed this vehicle to keep moving, while so obviously out of control. He put the odds around 5,001 against the possibility of a legitimate accident. That means this was deliberate. Behind several sheets of glass and steel, he and everyone else believed themselves to be perfectly safe. No one panicked. The Terrellium alloy walls, charged and bulletproof, provided more than adequate protection from a lunatic rental. As it approached, a massive thunderclap of energy exploded from the vehicle. The lights of the restaurant blinked and went out. Several other cars dropped like stones from the sky. The out-of-control vehicle headed directly for the restaurant. It smashed through the window, right over their table. Then it detonated. The ensuing explosion ripped a 3-story hole in the complex, killing 43 citizens that afternoon, including Dr. Andrew and Mrs. Anastasia Fox. In the observation lab, Reed and his colleagues panicked. Mrs. Fox's monitors had gone black, her vitals non-existent. They're both dead, Mr. Fox's supervisor Sanders said. Accident? Reed asked. That was no accident. Mr. Samuel hopped out of his chair. That was an explosion. Their fail-safes went off. Ortiz gestured for Samuel to return to his seat. Let's think about this. If that wasn't an accident, they'll be on their way here directly. The commanding officer of the lab, Colonel Ross, was ex-Special Forces. Rumor was that he'd taken his spot at the lab as a favor to Dr. Fox in some Faustian bargain involving revenge and each other's immortal souls. Ross didn't say anything, despite the glances from his subordinates. Mrs. Fox's operator, Wash, looked back at Sanders. We can't let them take the lab. Not after everything that happened last time. Colonel Ross nodded and stood up. We have a protocol. While working the civilian post, the colonel dressed in civilian clothes, a sharp suit, tailored to conceal his sidearm. Without the slightest hesitation, he fluidly drew the weapon and shot each member of the team in the head. He then moved to each man and put 2 rounds in their chest cavity. Colonel Ross opened his desk drawer and removed an unlabeled glass bottle. He poured the acid onto the face and hands of each of his agents. It took a moment, but soon pale white smoke began to rise as the acid ate away at the soft tissue. Back at his desk, Ross took a deep breath before dousing his own face and hands with the acid. Then as the smoke began to rise from his own skin, he raised his handgun to his mouth. He bit down hard on the barrel and pulled the trigger. A few moments later, gas jets set into the floor, ignited and proceeded to incinerate the command center. Ashley sat in 6th-hour English, drenched in sunlight, laced with a perfumed breeze. Just after lunch and siesta warm, it was quite possibly the sleepiest class of the day. The boys tried to repress their drowsy love for the young teacher, as Miss Timmerman, one of the sexiest instructors in the school, read aloud from Watership Down. The ancient classic told the story of a small group of orphaned rabbits in their search for a new home. The intercom screeched to life and released a contagion of yawns through the classroom. Is this 208? Is this Miss Timmerman? The unseen administrator asked. Miss Timmerman answered in the affirmative, but the interval for her answer was so dangerously short she doubted that they heard her. Please send Ashley Fox to the administration office. She can bring her things. She won't be returning to class. Thank you. Miss Timmerman looked over to Ashley and nodded. Ash stood, returned Miss Timmerman's nod, Mandy's wave, and walked to the door. Outside in the locker-lined hallway, once the door closed, Ashley stood for a moment. Miss Timmerman began reading again, continuing the adventure. Ash leaned against the wall, listening to her melodic voice, She wanted to know what happened to Hazel, Bigwig, and the other rabbits. She missed a few sentences of the muffled story and couldn't regain the thread. Frustrated, she turned away. The hall stood bright and vacant. Ash moved with exaggerated slowness. She arrived at the door to the administration office without encountering anyone. She leaned against the doorframe, hearing little from inside. She waited, watching the shadows moving behind the frosted glass, trying to catch a hint of what lay in store for her. 3 full minutes passed as she waited and listened. There were several people in the office, 2 men standing just on the other side of the door, big men who made the floor creak when they moved. There were several people in the office. No one spoke, which seemed strange. Ash adjusted her books and reached toward the knob. She heard someone sniffling, crying. She opened the door, revealing 2 uniformed Angel City police officers. Behind them, her brother sat on the counter, his eyes wet with tears. Jeff sprinted past the officers and jumped into his sister's arms. The taller agent stepped forward. "Is your name Ashley Fox?" Ashley nodded. The officers moved their mouths. She understood their words, but later she couldn't recall hearing them. From somewhere underwater, they told her that her parents had been killed in a traffic accident. She understood, but she didn't hear their voices. She didn't hear the sounds. Jeffrey sobbed her name like a prayer. She didn't breathe. Her mind clung to worthless details. The officer talking was a taller one. On his arm, 3 stripes. The other stood shorter, younger, 2 stripes. His hand resting on the butt of his weapon. They had badges but no name tags. Ashley felt trapped. She checked out the hall behind her. It remained empty. 3 stripes continued talking. He moved past the siblings and stepped into the hallway. Ash and Jeffrey followed, 2 stripes behind them. 3 stripes looked up and down the halls, watched doorways, and constantly looked over his shoulder, but he didn't watch her. 2 stripes kept his hand on his weapon. They went to Ashley's locker. They told her to take everything she wanted to keep, but to leave the books. She wouldn't be coming back here again. She dropped off her English text and packed the bag. Ash closed her locker and looked at the officers. Unseen, the black metal prototype lay nestled in her palm. The Micronics had once been her father's. It had fallen to her the last time he was killed, over 2 years ago. When he returned, he hadn't asked for it back. Now she kept it with her at all times. She relaxed, feeling its weight in her palm. Jeffrey was capable of using it as her father had, as a liquid core computer, capable of projecting the cyberverse directly into the user's mind. Ashley wasn't interested in that aspect of it at all. If something happened, Ashley would engage the device's more primitive functions. It doubled as a lethally sharp switchblade. Outside the school, the officers led them to the cruiser. The sergeant opened the hatch. The corporal pulled out the handcuffs and stepped toward the children. Ashley stepped between him and Jeff, the scowl on her face making her intentions clear. Jeff thought she'd gone crazy. Even she couldn't take on 2 cops. Then he saw the Micronics hidden behind her back and stepped to the side. The corporal frowned, raised an eyebrow, and took another step forward. Ash let the pack slide off her shoulder and defensively raised her empty left hand, curled in a loose fist. She brought her right around to hang loosely over her stomach. The corporal was stunned. He didn't know what to do. The sergeant looked over at the confrontation. "What the hell are you doing?" he asked his partner. The corporal answered by yelling over his shoulder. "Any civilian traveling in department vehicle will wear restraints. You know the regulations." "Get on board, Corporal," the sergeant ordered. Corporal rolled his eyes and returned the cuffs to his belt, bowing low and gesturing for Ash and Jeff to freely pass. Ash picked up her bag and Jeff smiled at her. She winked in reply. Inside the transport, Ash gave the sergeant their address, and they suffered the remainder of the ride in silence. Jeff leaned forward, his head pressed against the beryllium-tinted glass. The air outside the transport reached 100% humidity. Raindrops drenched the vehicle and ran down the windows, their shadows trickling across the inside. The Angel City traffic crept along in that cautious, panicked, and slow as molasses way that only Angel City traffic does, whenever confronted with the awesome malevolence of Mother Nature in the form of a bit of drizzle. Chapter 3. Happy Birthday. The transport drifted to an imperceptible landing in the courtyard of the top-shelf home. Ashley and Jeff trudged up the rain-slicked walk, followed by the officers. Jeff raised his hand to the access panel, and it recognized him as a resident. The front door slid back, revealing an inappropriately decorated house. Ash, Jeff, and the officers stood shocked. A happy birthday banner stretched across the main room, attached to the ceiling in the far wall. A nearby table sat covered with presents. The balloons and streamers felt wrong, perfectly cruel. The empty house magnified the awkwardness of the moment. The decorations anchored them, threatened to leave the four of them on the step for eternity. "Are you surprised?" Jeff asked his sister. "I thought they forgot," she answered. "They made me promise not to say anything." "This better not be somebody's idea of a joke," the corporal said. "You're such a jerk," the sergeant replied. Ash looked at the ground. Jeff looked up to his sister as tears welled in his eyes. He turned and ran inside, past the presents and up the stairs. The streamers and strings on the inflated balloons swayed in his wake. Ashley followed after him, but the sergeant interrupted her flight. "Excuse me, miss," the sergeant said, stepping forward. "I'm sorry, but we aren't permitted to leave you guys here on your own. We're just here so you can pack some personal items. You know, a change of clothes, socks, underwear, toothbrush. We still need to bring you back to the station." Ashley stared at him. "It would be criminal negligence for us to just leave you here." "I'm just going to go up then." Ashley gestured to the stairs. The officer nodded for her to go ahead. Ash left them to the lower level of the house. She stopped outside her brother's room. He sat on the bed, blankly staring into space. "Jeff?" Ash sat next to him on the bed and put her arm around him. He stared at the floor. Downstairs, the officers milled about. "Nice place," the corporal commented. "Yeah, not bad," the sergeant agreed. In the backyard, Mono lay sleeping just outside the sliding glass doors. The domesticated lion heard the sounds from inside and raised his head. Somehow, he'd slept through their entry and only now heard the strange voices. He stood and stretched. The animal saw the strangers standing inside the house. He looked at them, blinked once, then again, and yawned. Created in a laboratory, Mono had been part of a recombinant DNA experiment. The project's stated goal had been to develop a feline counterpart for law enforcement operations. A cat that could be trained and employed like a police dog, only better. Too docile to be properly considered, the Defense Department classified Mono as an unsupportable line of inquiry. The king of the urban jungle poked his head through the oversized doggy door. His body followed, and soon the entire cat stood inside the house. The officers froze with shock. Mono ignored them and cleaned a paw. "What the hell is that?" the corporal exclaimed. "Looks like a giant cat to me." The sergeant kept his voice low. Ashley appeared at the top of the stairs and called to him. Mono looked away from the cops, trotted past them and up the stairs. "He's just a cat," she said calmly. "He's not just anything," the corporal replied. Ash smiled, left the officers, and walked Mono to Jeffrey's room. Mono walked over to Jeff and pushed his face up against the boy's. Jeff made room for the massive animal to curl up on the bed next to him. He did. "What about Mono? Who's going to take care of him?" Jeff asked, hugging the cat. Without answering, Ashley stepped away. Down the hall, she entered her own room. Despite the open door, the room remained dark. She walked over to the windows and ripped the heavy curtains from their frames. Light flooded the room. She stood breathing, unsure of what to do next. On a low table, across from the window, sat the large dollhouse her father had built for her years ago, before the prototype, before Dunkirk. It had been in her old room. She hadn't seen it since they'd left. Downstairs, the officers waited, much less at ease after the appearance of the oversized house cat. They heard a crash from upstairs, the sound of breaking glass and snapping wood. Something big smashed through a window. A moment later, the object exploded into the front lawn, amid a hail of glass and window dressing. The officers stared out at the ruins of a dollhouse. They looked up to the ceiling overhead and then back down to the girl's shattered childhood. "Maybe we should let them take their time," the sergeant suggested, drawing a silent affirmation from his partner. An hour or so later, Ash and Jeff appeared with their bags. Ashley also had her hoverboard tucked under her arm. "I'm sorry, but you can't bring that," the sergeant said. "It would just get stolen anyhow," the corporal added. Ash took the board back up to her room. They silently followed the officers out of the house and back to the department transport. The children looked utterly exhausted and somehow older. The transport lifted off, turning away from the Fox home and toward the gradually swelling traffic of the late afternoon. Jeff stared out the window, watching other vehicles give the police cruiser a wide berth in their climb toward the nearby freeway cable. The Prowler moved into lanes on the right side of the massive electromagnetic strand of braided street, flowing with the close cable traffic. The electromagnetic cable generated current used by the vehicles that ran alongside. Smaller guidelines ran with the freeway cable, delineating lanes and travel direction. Beacons mounted on the guidelines provided visual and aural alerts. In the center, closer to the cable, the beacons were brighter and further apart. In the outer lanes, where the current was weaker, they glowed faintly. The transport landed in the huge parking dock of the Angel City Police Department. The officers led Ash and Jeff through the bustling main hall to an opaque walled holding cell. The sergeant addressed them from the door. "Stay here. We'll send down a placement officer." He triggered the panel, and the otherwise indistinguishable section of the wall slid shut. Ash and Jeff took seats on the plastic bench. The various layers of plastic muffled the noise of the crowded central hall outside. The blurred shapes on the other side of the frosted walls seemed little more than fuzzy silhouettes. The volume of activity, as the officers put their clients through the processes of the department, illustrated confusion, in sharp contrast to the relative peace of their holding cell. Watching the hazy silhouettes, Ashley and Jeff discerned a scuffle. Blows were thrown, an officer went down. A gun was waved through the air and people hit the ground. In a single moment, everyone on the other side seemed to vanish and go silent. Only the criminal's shadow and that of his newly acquired hostage remained standing. 5 officers stood slowly, their weapons trained on the young man. He looked toward the door, a good 20 meters away. The hostage made her move and dropped. The standing officers fired, splattering pieces of the boy against the frosted wall. The bullets embedded themselves in the soft trap plastic panels. The blood splattered and ran. Ashley and Jeff stared in horror at the pink-splashed wall. The bullets lodged in the plastic like blackheads in the otherwise pure skin of the police station. Ashley and Jeff moved across the cell to sit on the floor, away from the wounded walls. They watched the hazy aftermath and observed that it wasn't so different from a reality cop vid, where all the participants were blurred out to comply with privacy regulations. Jeffrey leaned up against his sister and she put her arm around him. He pulled her hand up and looked at the black metal rectangle nestled in her palm. The sight of it calmed him, and he slept. Ash watched the blood-stained several layers of plastic. It turned entire panels pink and darkened the seams. Time passed slowly, if at all. Ash woke, startled to discover she'd been asleep. A suited detective stood at the open door. He was a big man, even for a cop. Thick sideburns offset his shaven head, gave his face an ominous appearance. He held a clipboard. "Come on, let's get moving. Chop chop." He gestured for Ash and Jeffrey to come out of the cell and stepped out of sight, deeper into the hallway. Ash didn't hear him walk away. She reasoned that he must have been patiently waiting in the hall. The door remained open. Fresh air made its way over to the siblings. Jeff stirred and sat up. He saw the open door and looked at his sister. Ash said nothing, but with a tilt of the head, narrowing of the eyes, and a subtle movement of her mouth, she communicated the situation to her brother. Together they stood and picked up their bags. She gestured for him to stay behind her. She counted the detective's patience as points in his favor, but the black rectangle remained in her palm. Jeff watched her. Her thumb rested on the knife's trigger. He breathed easier, knowing that his deadly sister led the way, secretly armed. His trusting calm helped her remain cool. To the young boy, she was everything. Ashley was ninja. He knew why she needed to sleep late all those early summer mornings. After he discovered her secret, he tried hard to catch her in the act, but never could. A couple months earlier, something woke him. Jeff had thought the hooded hoverboarder fleeing their house had been a burglar, but when he went into her room, Ashley was gone. It was almost 4 a.m. Jeff tried to stay awake. When he woke again, it was after 8. He opened her door and his sister was curled up in bed. She mumbled and pulled the blankets over her head. He hadn't seen her return, but he had seen her leave. Jeff surmised she could only be attending sunrise classes at the academy. He never asked her about it, but after that, he tried to stay quiet in the morning. In the hallway, the detective waited. As the siblings exited the holding cell, she watched the way he appraised her. He seemed to acknowledge her posture and the item hidden in her hand. He took a polite step back. "I'm sorry for your loss. I'm Detective Cole." Looking to Ash, he asked, "Do you remember me?" Cole had shaved his head, and the sideburns were new, but his face came back to her immediately. Now that he spoke, she remembered him and nodded. "Sorry about your partner," she said. Detective Urich had been recently wounded in a headline-making case, and later succumbed to his injuries. Cole nodded. "Thank you. Of course, we're still looking for Dunkirk. The feds interfere whenever they can. We can catch up more later, but for now I need you guys to come with me." Detective Cole led them down the hall. Ash noticed that he watched them in his peripheral vision, and at no time did he seem unprepared. Ash kept her brother in the lee of her movements, shielding him from any possible attack as they passed random people in the halls. The detective subtly tried to reinforce her maneuvers, positioning himself between the children and other officers or citizens. About halfway to their destination, they encountered a crowded hall packed tight with humanity. Cole caught Ashley's attention and gestured for Jeffrey to walk between them. The detective moved them through the crowd, and when they reached an empty hallway, Ashley relaxed a little. After wandering for what seemed like a mile, they arrived at the witness stacks. Cole punched a code into the access panel and the bay door opened. The large interior warehouse was lined with tracks and cables running off into the stacks. Room-sized safes, locked and maneuverable, robotically parked single-unit motel rooms. A room detached itself from the grid and approached the dock. Once secured, the hatch opened and revealed the interior. The unit was really just a large living room. 2 couches faced a dual-terminal coffee table. Mini fridges served as end tables for the vid-stream remotes. The couches were of the extra-long variety, doubling as a perfectly comfortable bed. There was a bathroom at the other end. Cole gave Ash some money. "Get some food." He gestured to the battered menu tethered to the phone, itself bolted to one of the refrigerators. "I need to figure out where you two are spending the night. Don't break anything." Ash thanked him as Cole vanished behind the sliding doors. The room kicked off from the platform, instantly losing itself among the dozen other such cubes. Jeffrey looked at the armored terminal and sturdily constructed couches. Don't break anything. Who is he kidding? Jeff jumped for the couch. Suddenly the box changed direction and slammed him deep into the well of a cushioned seat. He screamed in exhilaration. Ashley crashed into the other couch, her bag forgotten on the floor. Detective Cole maneuvered through a maze of halls and stairwells toward his office. Behind him, a tall man appeared, walking toward him. "Detective, how are you?" Leonard Waltman, Mayor Westbury's secretary, asked. "Feeling a little nauseous." Leonard smiled. "I've been asked to discuss a rather urgent matter with you." Detective Cole remained silent. "A couple of children were orphaned today." "Usually we get about a dozen," Cole answered. Leonard glanced at his watch. "It's still early." "What are you doing up? I thought your kind couldn't handle sunlight." "I'm sensing some anxiety in your tone, Detective. I'd have gone with hostility myself." "Is that a veiled threat?" "No, it's a direct threat, shit for brains." Leonard smiled. "Is that what you want me to tell him?" Cole stepped forward. "Tell His Highness that I told you to buzz off." "I'm just here to ensure that your orders are received and understood, Detective." "Thanks, Mr. Secretary." As quickly as he'd arrived, Leonard turned and walked away. He made the corner at the far end of the hall and was gone. Detective Cole waited for a moment and then continued through the maze of the department, one identical intersection after another. Finally, he reached an unmarked room, unlocked the door, and entered. The large room, wide with a low ceiling, stood spotted with support pillars. The detective made his way through the jumble of filing cabinets, overflowing bookshelves, and stuffed study carrels. The wall at the far side of the room was split lengthwise by a band of closed windows and horizontal hinges tinted against the brash California sun. Cole opened a tall filing cabinet and pulled out a new pack of cigarettes, a bottle of whiskey, and a glass. He peeled the plastic from the sweet-smelling tobacco pack and from the top of the whiskey bottle. He tapped out a cigarette and set it between his lips. Cole swung the window open and set the glass on a low, wide ledge. He slowly opened the bottle and filled the glass. Cole set the bottle beside it on the ledge. He removed the cigarette from his mouth and balanced it across the mouth of the glass. Cole sat facing the window, watching the Angel City afternoon slowly fade into evening. Across the department, Ash and Jeff picked at the cheap heat packet food, utterly uninterested. Later, they sat before the blaring monitors, the vid streams, as unappealing as the superheated foodstuff. Just after 6, Cole stood, lifted the unlit cigarette, and set it adrift on the Angel City wind. He tossed the whiskey out after it and shook the glass out. He returned the bottle and tumbler to their drawer, closed the window, and dragged his chair over to a nearby phone. The detective lifted the receiver and entered a number from memory. He'd set the call to audio only, displaying the Angel City Youth Facility's logo in place of a head and shoulders. Across the city, in the lobby of a large building, the phone rang. Outside the office, out of earshot from the ringing phone, the secretary crossed a set of stairs leading to the parking garage. The dialed connection continued to ring until someone answered it, elsewhere in the facility. The machine didn't get it. The light went from flashing to solid. Detective Cole fidgeted with some paper. He straightened his tie and pretended to be busy, hoping the ruse carried over into his voice. A female voice came on the line. Angel City Juvenile Facility, District 13, how may I help you? This was it. Direct contact with the target. District 13 Governor Agatha Dorchester Mame, cousin of Angel City Mayor Howard Westbury, suspected cannibalistic serial killer, murderer, and conspirational confidant of one Martin Evander Dunkirk. Detective Cole had several reasons to believe that District 13 had been a festering cancer of heinous evil, eating, sweating, and excreting the children of Angel City. He had been ordered to turn Ashley and her brother Jeffrey over to them, whereby they might help entrap the monsters or help them by eliminating the threat posed to Dunkirk by his only witness, Miss Ashley Fox. Cole was aware of how deep the conspiracy ran, implicating the mayor and his aide, Mr. Leonard Waltman, whom he'd just visited with only moments ago. He was also aware of the other lunatics in Governor Maine's psychotic administration aboard the most unlucky district. The recently deceased Dr. Fox was a genius. The fact that his daughter defeated a world-class serial killer astonished the detective. He did not believe it coincidence. Cole smiled to the phone. This is ACPD Juvenile Placement. We've got 2 kids here and I've got no beds. I know it's late, but can we send them your way? That's no trouble. We have lots of beds. We'll run the paperwork in the morning, she answered. Can you give us, say, 90 minutes? Cole asked. Of course. Names and ages? Brother and sister. Fox. Ashley, 15. Jeffrey, 11. We'll take good care of them. Thanks so much. Again, sorry about it being so late. Not a problem. Good evening, Detective. Cole set the handset down. A cold sweat broke out across his brow. He hadn't told her he was a detective. The mayor's office had tipped her off. He felt nauseous, but he was too late. The point of no return. No going back now. Or so he told himself.